Have you ever felt the ground vanish beneath your feet? Not as a figure of speech, literally. That sensation of waking up in the morning and taking 2-3 seconds to remember what happened. And when the memory arrives, it arrives all at once, heavy, without warning that it's going to hurt. The person is gone. The relationship is over. And you realize, in that exact instant, that you don't know who you are without it. You don't know what to do with the hours that used to be filled by another presence. You don't know how to sleep on the side of the bed that is now just yours. You don't know how to answer when someone asks how you're doing, because the honest answer is something you still can't put into words. This is the most terrifying and, at the same time, the most important moment in a human being's life. And it is exactly this moment that brings us here today. Welcome to the Quantum Wagon. I am the Quantum Architect. And before anything else, I need to say something with genuine urgency. If you are arriving at this series right now, you have entered in the middle of a journey that was built in very deliberate layers. Every episode prepares the ground for the next. Every thinker who appears here was introduced with intention. Every concept rests on what came before. If you haven't yet watched the previous episode, Healing After Loss, Rebuilding Identity from Pain, with Jung, Watts, Carl Rogers, Peterson, Dispenza and Hélio Couto, do that before continuing. This is not bureaucratic protocol. It's because what we're going to work through today only makes complete sense if you've already gone through what we worked on before. All the links are in the description. The entire series is organized in order. You will lose entire layers if you skip steps, and those layers are not decoration. They are the foundation of everything that comes after. With that said, for those who have been on this journey from the beginning, buckle up. Because today we're going to the deepest place this series has ever gone. Breakups destroy. Everyone knows that. The people around you confirm it with looks of pity. With the "you'll get over it," with the awkward silence of someone who doesn't know what to say but feels like they need to say something. And there's a problem with all those gestures. They treat the rupture as an accident, as something that happened to you and now needs to be fixed so life can go back to normal. But what if there is no normal to go back to? What if the rupture isn't a detour from the path, but the path itself? Think about this for a moment. You spent months, maybe years, maybe decades, building an identity around another person. You were the girlfriend of, the husband of, the partner of, and suddenly that suffix disappears. And what remains is the most terrifying question that exists. Who am I without this? Carl Jung had a name for the process that begins in exactly that moment. He called it individuation. And Jung was very honest about the nature of this process. It is not beautiful. It is not linear. It is not a smooth progression from point A to point B. It is painful, confusing, full of what Jung called the shadow. Everything we refuse to see in ourselves. Everything we push below the surface because it was inconvenient, frightening, or socially unacceptable. Jung said the crisis is not the problem. The crisis is the invitation. The relational rupture is the moment when the psyche decides that you have become too small for the container you were inhabiting. And when the psyche decides that, it acts, sometimes with gentleness, sometimes with a brutality that feels profoundly unfair. In other words, the relationship didn't end because something went wrong. The relationship fulfilled its deepest purpose, which was to show you who you have not yet become. Now let's arrive at the point that is going to structure everything in this episode. Because there is something that almost no conversation about breakups ever touches, and we need to touch it today with every bit of clarity we have available. The pattern that created the rupture is the same pattern that creates scarcity in other areas of your life. This is not a philosophical hypothesis. It is an observation that any experienced therapist will confirm. The way you related to that person, whether you were seeking approval, dissolving your own limits, surrendering your identity to keep the peace, or on the contrary, shutting yourself down out of fear of being truly seen, that same way is operating in your relationship with money, with work, with the opportunities you allow to pass. There is a vibrational set point that permeates everything, and the rupture, as painful as it is, may be the clearest signal you will ever receive that this set point needs to change. The next episode in this series, Why Your Reality Isn't Changing, will go directly into that connection. But before you go there, you need to come through here, through this episode. Because right now you are standing at the threshold between the first phase of our journey and everything that follows. And the threshold is the most uncomfortable and the most precious place of all. If this point moved something in you, leave a comment below telling us which rupture formed you the most. Not the one that hurt the most, the one that formed you the most. There is an enormous difference between the two. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, do it now and turn on the bell notification, because what's coming in the next episodes will require you to be present from the beginning of each one. You've probably heard someone say, "After a devastating separation, I didn't recognize myself anymore in that relationship." That is a phrase most people interpret in a very specific way. They think the relationship took away who they were, that the other person somehow erased them. And while that is sometimes partially true, most of the time the interpretation is inverted. The relationship didn't take away who you were. The relationship merely illuminated, with a brutal light directly in your eyes, with nowhere to look away, who you had not been for a very long time. Let's look at concrete cases not invented, composed from real stories that arrive every day to those who work in psychology and human development. The first case is Michael, 4 to 3 years old, 15 years of marriage, 3 kids, a mortgage in the suburbs, a life organized around a role he had, internalized so completely that he could no longer distinguish where the role ended and the person began. He managed accounts for a mid-size firm, not because he loved it, not because he had ever genuinely asked himself whether he loved it, but because it was stable. The paycheck arrived twice a month, and the benefits covered the family. A life built on the logic of predictability, a life that, from the outside, looked like success. The separation arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet conversation on a Sunday afternoon when his wife said, with a calm that Michael described as more frightening than any argument they had ever had, "I don't know who you are anymore. And I think you don't know either." Carl Rogers would have recognized that state immediately. Michael was living with an enormous and unexamined gap between his real self, the person who had placed an entire collection of desires and capacities in storage under the justification of being responsible, and his presented self, the reliable employee, the dependable husband, the present father who never disappointed and never surprised. For Rogers, this incongruence is not a rare or pathological condition, it is epidemic. And it is the root of almost every psychological anguish he observed across decades of clinical practice. The relationship didn't create Michael's incongruence. The relationship was the container where he could keep it hidden from himself, as long as another human being was defining the rhythm, the preferences, the plans. He didn't have to confront how far he had drifted from himself. When that human being was gone, the confrontation became unavoidable. What the separation also revealed, Michael had notebooks, many notebooks, in boxers at the back of a closet, full of drawings and architectural sketches he had been making since his mid-20s and had never shown anyone. Not his wife, not his closest friends. He had wanted to be an architect when he entered college, had switched to business after his sophomore year because, as he put it in a conversation with his therapist 2 years after the divorce, it seemed more real, as if the thing he most wanted to do was somehow less real than the thing that would pay faster. Today, Michael works in facilities management during the day and takes online architecture courses at night. He hasn't made the full leap yet, and he says that honestly, but he knows who he is in a way that 22 years of a carefully managed life never allowed. And that, he will tell you, is worth more than any salary structure he has ever had. The second case is Rachel, 36 years old. For relationships in 12 years, each one following the same fundamental dynamic. She gave everything, the other person left. She explained it to herself as bad luck, as poor selection, as a flaw in the people she attracted. "I just keep picking the wrong ones," she would say. And each separation confirmed that story, because it was easier than the alternative. Until a therapist, at the fourth ended relationship in the same office, with the same expression of someone who had heard the same story before, asked a question that none of the 4 relationships had ever provoked. "What do you get out of always being the one who gives more?" Long silence. The kind of silence that signals a question has landed somewhere that hadn't been touched before. And then, slowly, with the voice of someone discovering something as they speak, "Control, if I give more, I can't be abandoned. Because if she leaves, it's her fault, not mine." Right. Esther Perel, the Belgian-American psychotherapist who has dedicated decades to studying desire, infidelity, and relational identity across more than 40 cultures, and who joins our wagon today for the first time, would say that Rachel was trapped in what she calls anxious fusion, the attempt to eliminate the distance between 2 individuals as a strategy for emotional security. And Perel is unsparing on this point. Fusion does not create intimacy. It destroys it. Because real intimacy requires 2 distinct individuals. It requires outline. It requires boundary. It requires that you remain recognizable as someone separate from the other person. Rachel had dissolved her own contour to avoid being abandoned, and in doing so guaranteed that she would never be fully known. And whoever is never fully known is, at some level, abandoned anyway, just by the void rather than by the other person's departure. The 4th separation was the first time Rachel stopped telling the story of herself as the victim of bad choices and started looking at her own pattern. That, Jung and Rogers would say in unison, is where everything that matters begins. The 3rd case is Daniel, 29 years old. He had never ended a relationship by his own decision. Others had always ended things for him. Until, in an episode he himself described as inexplicable and a little frightening, he walked away from a relationship that, on the surface, was working. Stable job, caring partner, shared apartment, travel plans for the following year. He left without being able to articulate why, and the inability to explain it confused him more than the pain did. Joe Dispenza would explain Daniel's state in a way that neuroscience can support. The body knows before the mind does. Daniel's nervous system had been signaling for months before the conscious decision that this reality had reached the limit of what it was possible to grow within. The diffuse discomfort he was feeling, the restlessness that had no name, the persistent sense that something is missing without being able to name what, was his nervous system responding to a growing misalignment between the internal vibrational field he was expanding and the external environment that had stopped corresponding to that expansion. Dispenza calls this a state of incoherence between the inner being and the outer context. When that misalignment grows large enough, the system seeks rupture not as failure but as correction, as the body eliminating what no longer serves growth. Daniel didn't know this at the time. He only knew when, about a year and a half later, he was in a completely different relationship, not because the partner was objectively better, but because he had become a different person. And a different person inevitably attracts and sustains a different reality. And now we arrive at this chapter's exercise. Take a sheet of paper or open a note on your phone. Divide it into 3 columns or 3 separate sections. This is called the 3-layer rebirth. In the first column, write down everything that was lost. The person, the shared rituals, the plans that existed, the identity of being in a relationship, the routines, the dreams that were 2 people's dreams. Don't filter. Don't organize. Put everything that disappeared when this reality ended. In the second column, for each item from the first, ask one very specific question. Was this a circumstance or was it essence? In other words, was this something external I had, or was this something I was? The Sunday tradition was a circumstance. The capacity to care for another person is essence. The apartment was a circumstance. The generosity is essence. The travel plan was a circumstance. The desire to explore the world is essence. Separate them with the most brutal honesty you can bring to bear. In the third column, write what remains. After removing everything that was circumstance, what is left? Which qualities, desires, values, and talents existed before that relationship and continue to exist now, even if silent, even if buried under layers of pain? These are the building blocks of your real identity. These were not lost. They were suppressed, and suppressed is not the same as destroyed. This exercise sounds simple in description and is profoundly disorienting in practice, because many people discover that the third column is nearly empty, that when they remove the circumstances, very little identifiable essence remains. And that is not a tragedy. It is exactly the information you need. A nearly empty third column does not mean there is no essence. It means the essence was suppressed for long enough that you lost contact with it. And recovering that contact is the work this protocol was designed to begin. Hélio Couto, working with quantum physics applied to human evolution, would describe this exercise as a form of field retuning. Every item you identify as essence is a frequency that kept transmitting even while it was muffled. And frequencies do not disappear. They only get covered by noise. The exercise is a process of removing the noise to hear the original signal, what happens in the brain when a long relationship ends. This is not metaphor. This is neurochemistry. And understanding it won't make the pain disappear, but it will change the relationship you have with it. Neuroimaging research, published over the past 15 years, particularly the work of anthropologist Helen Fisher and the team at Stony Brook University, reveals something that most people find genuinely difficult to accept. The brain of someone who has just been through a romantic breakup shows activation in the same neural regions that activate during cocaine withdrawal, literally the same reward center, the same compulsive seeking of the lost stimulus, the same reduction in prefrontal cortex activity, which is the region responsible for rational decision-making, long-term planning, and emotional regulation. In other words, you are not weak when you cannot stop thinking about the person. You are not being dramatic when the pain lasts longer than your social circle thinks it should. You are in real neurological withdrawal. The judgment you make about yourself during this period. I should be over this by now. I'm pathetic for still feeling this way. Any normal person would have moved on. That judgment is being made by a brain that literally does not have full access to its higher cognitive functions at this moment. It is like demanding that someone running a high fever solve a differential calculus problem and blaming them for failing. This is science, not an excuse. Information, and information changes what is possible to do with an experience. Joe Dispenza enters here with what may be the most transformative perspective on this neurological process, and the one with the most practical implications for anyone in the middle of a rupture right now. Dispenza spent years studying neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize itself in response to new experiences, and, what is even more powerful, in response to new thoughts and deliberately sustained emotional states. And he arrived at a conclusion that sounds simple in its formulation but carries profound implications. Most people, when they go through a breakup, use all available mental energy to recreate the past. They replay memories. They relive conversations. They imagine how it would have been different if they had said something else, acted differently, noticed sooner what they didn't notice. And every time they do that, they strengthen the neural circuits associated with that past reality. The brain, Dispenza explains, does not distinguish between a real experience and one that is imagined with sufficient emotional intensity. When you spend 3 hours reliving that last argument, that last kiss, that last conversation, the brain registers it as happening now and releases the same neurotransmitters and strengthens the same patterns, and the body enters the same physiological states. You are literally keeping yourself anchored to the past at a biochemical level, not through weakness of character, through a very powerful neurological mechanism doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is maintaining the continuity of the known identity. The way out for Dispenza is not simply don't. Think about the person. That advice is about as useful as telling someone with a suppressed reflex to stop reflexing. The way out is to redirect creative energy toward the active construction of a new identity, one that does not yet exist as concrete experience, but that can be built neurologically through deliberate and repeated practice. This is what he calls becoming nobody to become somebody. You first need to dissolve the identity built around that reality so a new identity can emerge. And this process has phases, has rhythm, and crucially, has a direction that can be consciously chosen. Carl Jung would say that Dispenza is describing, in the language of modern neuroscience, what analytical psychology has always known. The individuation process requires the symbolic death of the old self, not the death of the person, not the erasure of the history, the death of the version of yourself that could only exist within that specific context. Jung worked with a concept he called enantiodromia, a Greek word he borrowed from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus. The idea is that everything that reaches an extreme inevitably converts into its opposite. A relationship that reached the maximum of fusion and codependency inevitably collapses into its opposite: separation, isolation, a forced return to the self. And what emerges from that collapse, when traversed with awareness, is what Jung called the self with a capital S, the totality of the being that includes both what we know about ourselves and what the unconscious is still holding in reserve to reveal at the right moment. Alan Watts, with a perspective that had the gift of feeling simultaneously obvious and completely new, would add an observation that transforms how we can approach this process of death and rebirth. Watts frequently used the image of water to describe the relationship between identity and context. Water doesn't resist the container. It assumes the shape of the space it occupies. But if the container breaks, the water doesn't fail. It doesn't become less water. It simply flows into the next available space. And if that space is larger, the water occupies more area, reveals more of itself, expresses possibilities that the previous container would never have accommodated. The human problem, Watts would say with that affable irony that was his signature, is that we identify with the container and then grieve the loss of the shape when the container breaks, without realizing that what mattered was never the shape. It was always the water. You are the water. The relationship was the container. And the fact that the container broke diminishes nothing of what you are. It only changes the form you are assuming now. And depending on where you flow next, that form can be far larger than anything the previous container would have allowed. Esther Perel, the special guest of this episode, who the quantum architect is delighted to bring into the wagon for the first time, contributes a perspective that complements everything we've discussed in a way that none of the other thinkers formulates with the same clinical precision. Perel has spent decades researching the psychology of desire, betrayal, and relational identity across more than 40 cultures. She observed what happens to people after ruptures in radically different contexts, different economies, different cultural values, different family structures, and she identified something that very few therapists have the courage to state this clearly. In many separations, what died was not the love. It was a version of yourself that the relationship had room to sustain. Perel calls this the death of a possible self. When a long relationship ends, it is not only the other person who leaves. What also leaves is the version of you that existed in that context, the role you played, the narrative you told about yourself within that structure, the plans that only made sense within that specific horizon. And the central question that emerges is not how do I get over this, because getting over something presupposes returning to a prior state that, in most cases, no longer exists. The question is, which self am I going to build now that this particular self is no longer possible? That question, says Perel, is the one people most avoid, because it requires looking into the void without any guarantee that something will appear on the other side. And at the same time, it is the most liberating question of all, because it is the only point from which a genuinely new life becomes possible. Jordan Peterson, with that almost surgical precision that characterizes his approach, would add that there is a specific responsibility that emerges from this moment. Peterson has repeated in different contexts an idea that is simple in its formulation and demanding in its application. When a structure of meaning collapses, whether a relationship, a career, a foundational belief, the human being faces a choice. That may not feel like a choice, but absolutely is one. The choice is between using the energy of chaos to build something new or using that same energy to reconstruct the familiar, even when the familiar was what was suffocating the growth. Most people, facing the chaos that a rupture installs, run back to known order as quickly as possible. They seek another relationship with the same fundamental dynamic. They reproduce the same conditions under a different name, because the unknown, even when it represents freedom, is more frightening than familiar pain. Peterson would call this a failure of integrity in the structural sense. The identity has lost its structure, and instead of building a new structure from the most authentic materials available, the person gathers the pieces of what broke and tries to reassemble the same vase, and then the cycle repeats. Before we move to the next chapter, I need to make something very clear about what is coming in this series, what we're going to work through in the next episode. Why your reality isn't changing will be, for many people, the most uncomfortable video they have watched on this journey, because it will show with concrete specificity that the neurological pattern Dispenza described here, this addiction to the familiar, this compulsion to recreate what was lost, operates with the same force in every area where an established set point exists. In the relationship with money, with work, with opportunities that arrive and disappear without you understanding why. If what you heard in this chapter resonated something, that next episode was built for you. And it is not possible to understand it fully without having come through here first. Leave a comment below with what this chapter moved in you. Share it with someone who is in the middle of a rupture right now, not to comfort them, to show them that a different language exists for processing what they're living through. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell. And if you haven't yet watched the previous episodes in this series, start there. The series was designed as a journey, and every real journey has an order. There is a specific moment in the journey of someone who has been through a devastating rupture that is rarely described with precision. It is not the moment when the pain disappears, which can take far longer than any social timeline considers reasonable. It is the moment when the pain changes in nature. The pain of loss has a texture of emptiness, like a hole in the chest that air passes through differently than before. The pain of transformation has a different texture. It is less like emptiness and more like pressure, like something trying to be born from the inside and finding resistance along the way. It is uncomfortable in a different way. And when you learn to recognize the difference, you know something has shifted, that you crossed a threshold that was not visible from the other side. The stories we are going to tell now are about people who arrived at that second kind of pain, and what they did when they recognized what was happening. The first story is Andrew's, 47 years old when his wife asked for a divorce. 21 years of marriage, 3 children. A life organized around a function he had internalized so completely that he could no longer tell where the role ended and the person began. He taught high school mathematics, not because he loved teaching mathematics, a question he had never genuinely stopped to ask himself, but because it was secure, the paycheck arrived reliably, and the school calendar aligned with his kids' summers. A life built on the logic of predictability. The separation arrived not through an argument or a betrayal, but through a conversation at dinner one Saturday evening where his wife said, with a calm that Andrew described as more frightening than any shouting match they had ever had, "I don't know who you are, and I think you don't know either, Rogers." would have recognized immediately what was being described in those words. Andrew was living with a vast and unexamined gap between his real self, the person who had put an entire set of desires and capacities into storage under the justification of being responsible, and his presented self, the predictable teacher, the reliable husband, the present father who never disappointed and never surprised. For Rogers, this gap is not only psychologically costly, it is relationally devastating, because the other person, no matter how hard they try, cannot genuinely connect with someone who is not genuinely present to connect with. What the separation also revealed: Andrew had notebooks, many notebooks, in boxers in the back of a closet, filled with stories he had been writing since his late 20s and had never shown anyone. Science fiction, adventure characters who were, in retrospect, versions of himself living the lives he had filed away. Today, Andrew has published 2 books. He still teaches, and he says that with the humor of someone who has learned not to over-romanticize. But he is no longer only a teacher, he is a writer who teaches mathematics during the day. And he says, with a consistency that no one who knew him before the separation can honestly deny, that he has never felt as whole in his adult life. The second story is Claire's, 38 years old, a small but functioning business making custom handcrafted products. The central problem was that her business partner was also her boyfriend. When the relationship ended, not amicably, with disputes over equipment, clients, and the social media account they had built together, the business ended too. She lost both at once. For 3 months, Claire could not start anything new. The idea of building something again activated a level of paralysis she couldn't name. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't a lack of ideas. It was a fear of a kind she hadn't felt with that intensity before. The fear that if she tried again and failed, it would prove something about herself that would be unbearable to know. Dispenza would describe Claire's state as inverted biological coherence, when the body is so saturated with emotions of loss, shame, and fear that those emotions become the default state. The state the nervous system returns to automatically when it isn't occupied with something else. The brain begins to use that state as its reference point for interpreting the present and anticipating the future. And what the brain consistently anticipates, behavior tends to confirm, not by magic, by a very concrete mechanism. When you believe, at a non-conscious level, that you are not enough, that it won't work again, that you don't deserve for it to work, you make decisions that confirm those beliefs. You don't call the potential client because it probably won't lead anywhere. You don't ask for what you're worth because they'll think it's too much. You quit before being rejected to avoid having to feel the rejection. What shifted for Claire was an experience she cannot describe in any other terms than feeling in my body who I am when I'm not afraid, a field process, which will appear in the next chapter's protocol, that forced her to inhabit for a few minutes, before any external evidence, the frequency of someone who has already arrived, not who is going to arrive, who has already arrived. Hélio Couto works with this concept with a precision that combines quantum physics and psychology in a way that conventional science is still learning to describe in formal terms. The internal frequency shift precedes the change in external reality, not the other way around. You do not wait for reality to change and then change your frequency. You change your frequency, sustained and deliberately and repeatedly, so that reality can gradually begin to correspond. Claire today has her own business, without a partner. The revenue is not yet where she wants it to be, and she says that honestly, but the trajectory is recognizable in a way that she herself can see. And she says, with a clarity that sometimes surprises those who hear it, the collapse was the best investment I ever made. Not because it was cheap. It was the most expensive thing I ever lost. But I came out of it knowing exactly who I am without anyone else confirming it. The third story is different from all the others. Lucas and Patricia had been together for 8 years, separated, and came back. But when they came back 2 years later, they were not the same couple. And that is the difference that matters. Esther Perel has fascinating clinical research and observations about couples who go through ruptures and return. What distinguishes those who rebuild something genuinely new from those who simply repeat the same pattern in new packaging is surprisingly clear when you know what to look for. What happened during the 2 years of separation? Not what didn't happen. What did happen? How that time was used for what? Couples who use the rupture to work on their own individual identity. Real therapy, real self-knowledge. New relationships that teach them about themselves. Honest confrontation with the patterns that created the problems. Come back. When they come back, as different people. Couples who use the rupture only to miss each other come back the same. And within 6 months, the problems that caused the original separation have reappeared, slightly redecorated. Lucas spent the 2 years in therapy working specifically on the pattern of emotional shutdown he had built as a survival strategy in childhood, and that, inside the relationship, Patricia had experienced as indifference. Patricia traveled alone for the first time in her life, an experience she describes as learning that I can exist without someone else. Confirming that I'm existing. Both arrived at the end of the 2 years with more definition of themselves as separate individuals, with more clarity about who they were, independently, with more capacity to be two distinct people in a relationship rather than two halves that depended on each other to feel whole. Peterson would call the result of this genuine order emerging from chaos. Not the false order of going back to what it was, because what it was wasn't working, and pretending otherwise is just a slower form of collapse, but the higher order structure of building with the materials that the chaos revealed, something that the previous state would never have been large enough to hold. The fourth story is Sarah's, 52 years old when her husband of 28 years left. He left for someone else, with a completeness of absence of warning that Sarah described as waking up in a country where you don't speak the language and weren't told there would be travel. The pain was of an order of magnitude she describes as drowning in open water without knowing you were ever in the ocean. The first 6 months, she didn't want to rebuild that. Intention wasn't available to her. She wanted to understand. She wanted the logic. Why did this happen? What had she done wrong? What could she have seen? Perel is unflinching about this kind of investigative rumination. The search for why did this happen rarely takes the person where they think it will, because what the person is genuinely seeking, beneath the question about cause and effect, is not an explanation. It is absolution. It is proof that it wasn't her fault, or, more painfully, confirmation that it was, because at least then she would have had control. At least then the betrayal would make sense inside an ordered universe where things happen for discoverable and correctable reasons. What shifted for Sarah was not an answer to the question, why did he leave? It was an entirely different question that surfaced. Months later, in a conversation with her older sister, who were you before him? Sarah went quiet. Then she went looking for a journal in a box in her storage, space that she had kept without ever throwing away. She was 24 when she met her husband. She had just been accepted to medical school with a strong application. Within a year of the relationship, the dream had been quietly filed away because he had been selected for a position in another city and she went with him. Without drama, without conflict. Simply because it seemed like what you did. The dream wasn't forbidden. It was gradually rendered irrelevant by the logic of the relationship, the apartment, the years that kept passing. Today, at 54, Sarah is in her second year of medical school. Not because of him, not to prove anything to anyone, but for the 24-year-old woman who never got the chance to appear and who, it turns out, never gave up on herself. She had only waited. Jung would say, the self never gives up. It only waits. With a patience that sometimes resembles cruelty but is, in the end, the most consistent form of love that exists. We have arrived at the final chapter, and we have arrived at the place where everything we have discussed in this episode, and across all the episodes of this series, converts into concrete practice. What I am going to present now is a 7-day protocol. I want to be very precise about what it is and what it is not. It is not a list of positive affirmations to repeat in front of the mirror until the discomfort passes. It is not romantic visualization of an idealized future. It is a structured process built on the neuroscience of Dispenza, the analytical psychology of Jung, the person-centered therapy of Rogers, the philosophy of Watts, the pragmatics of Peterson, the relational wisdom of Perel, and the applied quantum physics of Hélio, Couto, and Aquila. Each day has a specific function. Each function corresponds to a layer of the identity reconstruction process, and the layers were ordered deliberately. It is not possible to jump from day 1 to day 5 and produce the same result. The sequence exists for reasons that become clear as you move through it. You can start tomorrow morning. You can start tonight. But if you're going to start for real. Day 1 is called naming the break. You are going to write out loud, and this matters, out loud, not just on the page, what ended. Not what you lost, what ended. Using the person's name when relevant. Using full names for the things that closed. The relationship with this person ended. The version of me that existed inside that relationship ended. I am grieving this and I have every right to grieve it. Why out loud? Because the nervous system distinguishes between silent thought and spoken declaration in a way that neuroscience is mapping with increasing precision. When you make a thought sound in physical space, it stops being only a sequence of neural activations and becomes something that exists in the world. Peterson would call this naming the chaos, the first act of differentiation between what is formless and what can begin to be worked with. You cannot work with what has not been named. You can only be controlled by it. Set aside 10 to 15 minutes for this. You may freeze. You may cry. You may discover there is more than you thought to name. Do not rush. Complete naming is the foundation of everything that follows. Day 2 is called separation, identity versus circumstance. You return to the 3-column exercise from Chapter 2. But now you go deeper into each item you identified. In the 3rd column, the essence that remains. For each quality or value you identified there, you ask 3 questions. How did this quality express itself before this relationship? How did it express itself inside the relationship? Or was it suppressed? And how does it want to express itself now, without the context that was shaping it? This deepening reveals something the initial exercise doesn't necessarily reveal: the difference between what you genuinely are and what you learn to be. Within that specific context, Rogers would call this recovering your internal locus of evaluation, the capacity to know what you value, feel and need without requiring external validation to confirm that it's real. Day 3 is called quantum breathing, and this is the only day without writing. It is a day of pure somatic practice, 20 to 25 minutes, in silence, with no competing content pulling for your attention. Lie down or sit with your spine aligned. Close your eyes, breathe deeply with a specific rhythm. 4 counts in, hold for 4 counts, 8 counts out slowly. During the exhale, visualize energy leaving the body, not with anger, with intention. You are not throwing away the person or the relationship. You are releasing the energetic charge that became lodged in you in the form of somatized memories, muscular tension patterns, and physiological states the body learned to associate with that reality. Dispenza has evidence, documented in studies with experienced meditators, that this type of breathing practice alters brain chemistry in measurable ways within single sessions, reducing cortisol, increasing heart rate variability coherence, and activating the parasympathetic nervous system. In more direct language, you move out of survival mode and into creation mode. And in creation mode, possibilities become available that simply do not exist in survival mode. Hélio Couto would say that you are changing channels, and that tuning to the new frequency is an act that precedes the new reality, not a result of it. Day 4 is called the future letter. You are going to write a letter, signed by you, from 3 years in the future, to the you of today. The letter should describe who you became, Not what you achieved, but who you became. What is the quality of your presence? How do you make decisions? How do you relate to people? What does it feel like to wake up in the morning? What is the internal tone of your everyday life? The writing. Instruction is specific. Use first person and present tense. Not I want to be, but I became, not someday I hope, but today I am. The sentence is, I became someone who 5, 6, 7 completions. With the specificity of someone describing a known reality, not someone fantasizing about an abstraction. Watts would smile here with the recognition of someone seeing an ancient principle in new form. He always said that the destination and the journey are the same thing, that consciously defining where you are going changes the nature of every step taken toward that place. Jung would add a different dimension. The letter is not fantasy, it is psychic instruction. You are giving the unconscious a clear direction for processing, and the unconscious, contrary to what modern rationalism sometimes presupposes, is tireless and remarkably efficient when it has a direction. Day 5 is called vibrational field. You return to the letter from the previous day. Read it out loud, slowly, with all the presence you can bring. Then close your eyes and spend the next 15 minutes doing something that the rational mind frequently resists. Feeling in your body what it is like to be that person, not imagining it intellectually. Feeling it. Where in the body do you notice security when you read those words? Where do you notice openness? Where do you notice expansion? Where do you notice resistance? And what kind of resistance is it? Dispenza calls this process the memorization of the emotional state of the future. The objective is that the body, not just the mind, learns what this new version of you is like. Because the body has a memory that operates independently of conscious memory. And what the body learns through repetition, it begins to seek to reproduce, adjusting behaviors, perceptions and choices in the direction of the frequency it has learned to recognize. Day 6 is called Fair Witness. Today you are going to write about yourself in the third person, as if you were an impartial, intelligent, and genuinely well-intentioned witness describing another person's journey. Describe what this person, you, has lived through in recent months or years, what they faced, where they were strong without realizing it, where they made mistakes with the intention of getting it right, where they learned through the most expensive method available. Rogers called this quality of attention unconditional positive regard, the same quality of attention a good therapist offers to the person in front of them. The absence of judgment does not mean the absence of clarity. It means clarity without the additional cruelty of the judgment that most of us apply to ourselves with a consistency we would never apply to someone we love. This exercise creates a productive distance, enough to see with greater accuracy, without the excess of self-criticism that blocks genuine learning. Day 7 is called Declaration of New Identity, and it is the simplest and the most demanding of all, in no more than 6 lines. You write your declaration of new identity, not a list of goals, not a list of things you want to have, a declaration of being. I am someone who, 6 completions, based on what you discovered and built in the 6 previous days, with the most honest and precise language you have available. And then, out loud, you read that declaration 3 times, once directed toward the past, with gratitude for what came, for what was necessary to bring you to where you are. Once directed toward the present, with recognition of where you are now, the work you did, the distance you traveled. Once directed toward the future, as declaration, not as request, as the affirmation of someone choosing, consciously, who they are going to be. Peterson would say, responsibility is the answer to chaos, not retroactive blame, not self-flagellation. Prospective responsibility, the decision to become the agent of your own story rather than the object of circumstances. This declaration is the act of assuming that responsibility in a formal and conscious way, of saying, in your own voice, in your own space, I choose who emerges from here. The post-rupture identity mantra was built to be repeated throughout the 7 days and beyond them. Ideally in the morning, before any screen, before any message, before any external narrative has the chance to set the tone of the day. Out loud, at the speed of someone speaking to be heard, not recited but declared. I am not what I lost. I am what remains when everything external is gone. I am the territory, not the map. The rupture did not destroy me. It stripped me down. And what is beneath the surface is the only place where real beginnings happen. I am the self that Jung described. I am the water that Watts defended. I am the field that Dispenza proves. I am the identity that Rogers protected. I am the reinvention that Perel documents. I am the frequency that Hélio Couto names. I am at the threshold. And the threshold is the most precious place there is. I am ready. This mantra is a structure. What you put inside it is yours. Replace the names with the ones that resonate most with you on this journey. Add a line that only makes sense for your specific story. Adapt the tone to your voice. What does not adapt is the intention. Conscious declaration of identity, not a request. Not a hope, a declaration. Before we go, the quantum architect needs to say something that is rarely said with this directness. Most of the people in this episode are here because of pain, not out of academic curiosity about Jung or neuroplasticity. They are here because something broke, because the ground disappeared, because they are trying to figure out how it is possible to rebuild when not even the materials for rebuilding are visible yet. That requires a kind of courage that most cultural narratives about moving on do not honor adequately. It is not the courage to move forward, which is how the process is usually romanticized. It is the courage to stop, to stay in the middle of the chaos without rushing to fill the void with the first available alternative, to sustain not knowing for long enough that something genuine can emerge. There is a particular version of this that shows up in American culture in a very specific way. We are trained from early on to treat pain as a problem to be solved on a schedule, to be productive about our grief, to demonstrate recovery, to have the answer to how are you, doing ready before the wound has had time to close. The Puritan inheritance runs deep, and one of its least examined legacies is the belief that suffering without visible productivity is a moral failing. It is not. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do with pain is let it do its work without rushing it toward a conclusion. If you have been in this process, this episode confirms that you have the capacity to sustain the discomfort that transformation requires, even if you do not feel courageous. Even if what you feel is mostly confusion or pain. The fact that you are here, asking these questions, seeking this different language, is not a small thing. It is one of the rarest things there is. What comes in the next episode will be uncomfortable in a different way. It will show, with a specificity that may sting, how the pattern that created the relational rupture is the same pattern operating in other dimensions of your life. It will be the most useful and the most difficult information to hear in this series so far. Do not jump ahead without completing the protocol. The sequence exists because it works in sequence, one step at a time. Hélio Couto closes this episode with a perspective that will stay with you into whatever quiet time you find today. Couto has always insisted that human evolution is not linear, it is spiral. You will return to the same point many times, the same pain of separation, the same pattern of loss, the same confrontation with your own identity, but each time from a different altitude. Not because you failed to learn definitively, but because the spiral keeps rising, and each turn reveals a deeper layer of the same essence. What changes is not the territory. It is the altitude from which you traverse it. And each time you cross from one level higher, what was obscure becomes slightly clearer. What was heavy becomes slightly lighter. What seemed permanent reveals itself to be only a phase of a journey that is, at its deepest, nature, a journey toward yourself. You are on that journey, and the fact that you are here confirms you are moving in the right direction. I am the quantum architect, and you did not arrive here by accident.